He found her crying in the bathroom, but when she told him why, his blood ran cold. A missing girl, a powerful secret, a school that wants it buried. Shaq thought he was just giving a speech. He didn't know he was stepping into a cover-up. But now, they're threatening him to stay silent, and if he doesn't stop digging, she might be the next to disappear. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal had seen a lot in his life. He had played on the grandest stages, earned millions, and stood in rooms filled with the most powerful people in the world. But none of that mattered when he walked into places like these, a local high school, where kids looked up at him with wide eyes, hoping for a reason to believe in themselves. Today was one of those days. The school had invited him to speak to students about perseverance, success, and the power of kindness. It was something he had done before, but every time, it felt different. The halls smelled of pencil shavings and cheap cafeteria food, and the walls were covered with posters screaming, "Dream big," and "You can do it." He adjusted his oversized suit jacket as the principal led him to the gym, where the students were already gathered. The moment he stepped inside, a ripple of excitement spread through the crowd. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into cheers. He smiled, raising a hand in greeting. Some kids pulled out their phones, snapping pictures, while others simply stared, caught between admiration and awe. But Shaq noticed something else. It wasn't just excitement that filled the air. There was a strange undercurrent, a stiffness, a hesitation. He had been in enough rooms to recognize when people were holding something back. The principal, Mr. Davidson, a thin man with sharp eyes, clapped his hands together. "All right, students, we're honored to have a true legend with us today, Mr. Shaquille O'Neal." Applause. Loud, but not as enthusiastic as it should have been. Shaq took the mic, flashing a grin. "Y'all acting like y'all don't know who I am." Laughter. That broke the ice a little. He launched into his usual speech, how he had come from humble beginnings, how he had been told no 1,000 times, how he had learned that greatness wasn't about size or strength but about heart. He told them about his mother, Lucille, the strongest person he had ever known. He told them about his struggles, his failures, and the lessons that had shaped him. And yet, as he spoke, his eyes scanned the crowd. Some students were locked in, hanging on to every word, but others sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. A few exchanged glances, not with excitement but with something else, something closer to unease. It was subtle, but it was there. When he finished, the applause was polite but not electric. As the students started to file out, Shaq stayed back, shaking hands and taking pictures. A few kids lingered, asking him questions about basketball, his height, his life. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught something, just for a second. A girl, slipping away. She wasn't running, but there was urgency in her steps. A quiet desperation in the way she moved, hugging her arms tightly across her chest. Shaq frowned, watching her disappear through a side door. Something about her stuck with him. "Who's that?" he asked, turning to the principal. Mr. Davidson followed his gaze, his expression briefly tightening before he forced a smile. "Oh, just one of our students. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. Shaq knew better than that. But before he could press further, another student approached him, asking for a selfie. He put on a smile, snapped the picture, and let the moment pass. Still, the feeling lingered. As the event wrapped up, the school bell rang, signaling the end of the assembly. Shaq walked down the hall, his massive frame moving carefully through the narrow corridors. Students parted for him, sneaking glances, whispering behind cupped hands. Something was off in this school. He just didn't know what. Then, faintly, he heard it. Crying. It was soft, barely there, but distinct enough to make him stop. The sound was coming from one of the girls' bathrooms at the far end of the hallway. Shaq hesitated. Schools had rules. He couldn't just walk into the girls' restroom, but something in his gut told him to wait. to listen. Sniffling, shaky breathing, a choked sob. He glanced around. The hallway was nearly empty now, only a few stragglers lingering by their lockers. He spotted a janitor nearby and gestured him over. "Hey, man," Shaq said, lowering his voice. "Can you check in there? Somebody's crying." The janitor, a gruff-looking man in his late 50s, glanced toward the restroom, then back at Shaq. For a moment he hesitated. Then, with a nod, he pushed the door open slightly. "Hello?" he called. "Everything all right in there?" Silence. Then a small voice. "Go away." Shaq frowned. The pain in that voice, it wasn't just embarrassment. It was something deeper. The janitor looked back at Shaq, unsure. Shaq made up his mind. "Tell her it's Shaq," he said. "Just let her know I'm out here." The janitor relayed the message. Another long silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the door opened just a crack. A girl stood there. Maybe 15, maybe 16. Dark curls framed her face, her brown skin blotchy from crying. Her eyes, wide, glassy, held something heavy, something broken. Shaq crouched down slightly, making himself smaller. "You good, kid?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. She just looked at him like she was trying to decide if she could trust him. Then, finally, she spoke. I don't know what to do," she whispered. Shaq's stomach tightened. He had no idea what she was about to tell him, but he knew without a doubt that it was going to change everything. Shaq had been in plenty of locker rooms, stadium tunnels, and high-rise boardrooms, but none of them felt as cold as this empty school hallway. The weight of the girl's broken voice still sat heavy in the air. He crouched down slightly, keeping his posture open, non-threatening. The janitor had already backed away, sensing that this conversation wasn't for him. The girl, Zariah, he would learn her name soon, kept the door cracked just enough for one eye to peek through. "You don't gotta talk if you don't want to," Shaq said, his voice as soft as a man his size could make it. "But I can tell something's wrong." She sniffled, but didn't open the door any further. He could see the edge of her sleeve as she wiped at her face. "I'm fine," she mumbled. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had kids of his own. He knew when a child was lying. He could see it in the way her shoulders curled inward, in the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "You sure about that?" he asked. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, just barely above a whisper, she said, "No." That was all Shaq needed to hear. He shifted, leaning against the wall beside the bathroom door instead of crouching in front of it. He gave her space, let her control the situation. "Take your time," he said. "Ain't no rush." She didn't speak right away. He could hear the unsteady rhythm of her breathing, the slight hitch in her throat when she tried to hold back another sob. Finally, the door opened a little wider. Zariah stepped out just enough for Shaq to see her fully. She was wearing a school hoodie, the sleeves stretched at the cuffs like she had been gripping them too hard. Her dark brown skin was blotchy from crying, and her deep eyes looked hollow, like she had been carrying something too heavy for too long. Shaq had seen pain before, but this was different. "Somebody hurt you?" he asked. Her head snapped up, panic flashing in her eyes. "No, not like—" She stopped herself, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Not like that." Shaq understood. "Something happened," he said instead. She swallowed hard and nodded. He waited, letting the silence stretch. Sometimes people needed time to pull their words together. Then, in a shaky voice, she finally said, "They left something in my locker." Shaq frowned. "Who?" She hesitated. "I don't know, but it was bad." Shaq didn't push. "You still got it." She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she handed it over. Shaq unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. What he saw made his stomach tighten. It wasn't just a mean note. It was something much worse. A threat. A racist, vile, hateful threat. The kind of thing that made his blood run cold. His jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that reacting with anger wouldn't help right now. This wasn't about him. "This, the first time this happened?" he asked. She hesitated. Shaq's chest ached at that pause. It told him everything. "How long?" he asked gently. She looked away. "Months." Months. He exhaled slowly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Who else knows?" he asked. Zariah let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "No one cares." Shaq frowned. "That ain't what I asked." She blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in his voice. She shifted uncomfortably. I told a teacher once." Shaq leaned in slightly. "And?" Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "She said I was probably overreacting." Shaq felt his fingers curl into a loose fist. "Anybody else?" he asked. She hesitated again. Then, softer this time, she said, "The principal knows." Shaq's expression darkened. "He knows?" She nodded. "And he didn't do nothing?" Her lip quivered. "He said it was just kids being kids." Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He looked back at the note in his hands, the ink smudged from where her fingers had clutched it too tightly. This wasn't just kids being kids. This was evil. And the fact that the people in charge were brushing it off? That made his stomach turn. Zariah was looking at him now, her eyes full of something fragile. "Why'd you tell me?" he asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Because you're the first person who actually seems like they care." That hit Shaq hard. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed. Zariah's eyes widened. "Wait, who are you calling?" Shaq looked her dead in the eye. 911. Her breath hitched. "No. Wait, you can't." "Why not?" She shook her head quickly, panic creeping into her voice. "Because they'll just say I'm making a big deal out of nothing. They won't do anything, and then it'll get worse." Shaq held her gaze. "You scared of them?" he asked. She blinked. "Who? Whoever did this?" She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. Shaq's grip on his phone tightened. "That's exactly why I'm calling," he said. Zariah looked down, her hands gripping her sleeves again. Shaq softened his voice. "Listen, I know you think this don't matter. I know people let you down before. But this is not okay. And I ain't gonna let it slide." She didn't look up, but she gave the faintest nod. The call rang twice before a dispatcher picked up. Shaq's voice was steady. "This is Shaquille O'Neal. I'm at Lincoln High School. I need officers down here immediately. A student has been receiving violent threats." The dispatcher confirmed the details, promising to send officers right away. Shaq hung up and looked back at Zariah. "They're coming," he said. "You trust me?" For the first time, Zariah looked like she was about to cry for a different reason. She nodded. Shaq rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to fix this," he said. He just didn't know yet how deep the problem ran. But he was about to find out. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. He had seen the highs of fame, the lows of struggle, the quiet moments where a man either rises or falls. But looking into Zariah's eyes, he saw something different, something deeper. This wasn't just fear, it was exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting a battle you knew you couldn't win. They sat on a bench outside the principal's office, waiting for the police to arrive. Shaq had insisted on staying with her, not willing to leave her alone, not after what he had just heard. Zariah sat hunched over, arms wrapped around herself. Her sneakers tapped against the tile floor, restless. She hadn't spoken since the phone call. Shaq finally broke the silence. "You want to tell me everything now?" She swallowed hard, eyes locked on the floor. "It started months ago," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq leaned in slightly, listening. "At first, it was just stupid stuff," she continued. "People whispering when I walked by. My books going missing. Someone knocking my lunch tray over and acting like it was an accident." Shaq frowned. "You knew who was doing it?" She hesitated, then shook her head. Not at first. They made sure I never saw. But it wasn't random. They wanted me to know it was on purpose. Shaq stayed quiet, letting her talk. Then the notes started, she said. In my locker, my backpack, sometimes in my desk before class started. Shaq thought about the crumpled piece of paper she had handed him earlier, the hateful, ugly words scribbled in thick, angry handwriting. They got worse over time, she admitted. At first, they just called me names. Then they started saying I didn't belong here, that I should transfer to a school for people like me. Shaq's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. Then, she took a shaky breath. Last week, they said if I didn't leave, they'd make me. Shaq's grip on his knee tightened, but he kept his voice calm. And nobody did anything? Zariah let out a sharp, bitter laugh. I told my history teacher, she said. She told me to ignore it. Shaq's stomach twisted. I told my counselor. She said maybe I was misinterpreting things. Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his anger in check. I told the principal, she continued, voice hollow. You know what he said? Shaq didn't answer. He said, maybe if you stopped acting like a victim, people would leave you alone. Shaq's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just neglect. This was a cover-up. He shook his head. Why didn't your parents step in? Zariah went still. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, I didn't tell them. Shaq looked at her in disbelief. Why not? She swallowed. Because my mom works 2 jobs. She's barely home as it is. My dad, he's not around. If I told her, she'd worry. She'd march down here, start a fight, and then… She shook her head. They'd just say she's an angry black woman. They'd say I was overreacting, and it would get worse. Shaq let that settle. He had seen it before. The way people twisted the truth. The way power protected itself. Zariah had been alone in this fight for months, and then, today, something had pushed her to her breaking point. Shaq's voice was low. What happened today? Zariah hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into her backpack and pulled out another note. This one was different. It wasn't just words. It was a printed photo. A picture of Zariah, taken from behind, walking home from school. The message beneath it was short. We see you. Shaq's entire body tensed. This wasn't bullying anymore. This was a threat. And someone had been following her. He turned the photo over in his hands, his mind racing. Zariah, he said carefully. Do you know who took this? Her breath hitched. Number. But I think I know who's behind it. Shaq looked at her sharply. Who? She licked her lips nervously. There's this group, a bunch of kids from rich families. They do whatever they want and no one stops them. They never get in trouble. Ever. Shaq's stomach sank. How many? He asked. 5 or 6, she said, but everyone knows they run things around here. Shaq had seen this before. Schools where privilege meant protection, where the kids with the right last names got to play by different rules. Zariah's voice dropped lower. They call themselves the Circle. Shaq frowned. The Circle? She nodded. They act like they own this place. If they don't like you, they find a way to make your life hell. And if you cross them… Her voice trailed off. Shaq leaned in. What happens? Zariah hesitated. Then, finally, she whispered, People disappear. Shaq's pulse kicked up. Disappear? He repeated. Like, they transfer? Zariah's hands clenched in her lap. They disappear. Shaq stared at her, unblinking. There was a girl last year, Zariah said. Her name was Alana. She started getting bullied bad, worse than me. Then one day, she just stopped coming to school. Everyone thought she transferred, but nobody knew where. Shaq's stomach churned. Did anyone ask? He pressed. Zariah swallowed. They did. At first, but the principal just said she left for personal reasons. No one ever saw her again. Shaq leaned back, exhaling. This was bigger than he thought, and it wasn't just about Zariah. "This circle," he said. "You ever hear them talk about Alana?" Zariah hesitated. Then, finally, she nodded. "Once," she whispered. "They were laughing about something in the cafeteria. One of them said, 'Guess she got the message.'" Shaq rubbed a hand down his face, trying to keep his anger in check. This wasn't bullying. This was a system. A system designed to silence kids like Zariah. A system that had already erased at least one student. Shaq looked at her, his voice steady. "You ain't gotta be scared no more," he said. "We're blowing this wide open." Zariah swallowed. "What if they come after me?" Shaq's expression darkened. "They won't," he said, "because I'm here now." For the first time, Zariah looked like she almost believed him. The sound of footsteps interrupted them. The police had arrived. And everything was about to change. Shaq kept his grip tight on his phone, his other hand resting firmly on Zariah's shoulder. She was shaking, and he could feel the weight of her fear. This wasn't just schoolyard bullying. This was something bigger, something darker. The dispatcher's voice came through the line, steady and professional. 911, what's your emergency? "This is Shaquille O'Neal," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "I'm at Lincoln High School. A student has been receiving violent threats. I need officers here now." The dispatcher didn't hesitate. "Understood, sir. Officers are on their way. Can you tell me if the student is in immediate danger?" Shaq glanced at Zariah. She was gripping her sleeves again, her fingers digging into the fabric. He wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, but the truth was, he didn't know that yet. "She's safe with me," he said, "but I need them here fast." The dispatcher confirmed their arrival time before the call ended. Shaq slipped the phone back into his pocket, his focus locked on Zariah. "You did the right thing," he said. Zariah didn't look at him. She just stared at the floor, her breathing uneven. "You don't understand," she whispered. Shaq frowned. "Understand what?" Before she could answer, a sharp voice cut through the hallway. "What is going on here?" Shaq turned to see a man storming toward them. Thin, graying hair, an expensive-looking watch, and a face carved into a permanent expression of authority. Principal Davidson. Shaq could already tell what kind of man he was. The kind who ran things with a smile in public but made sure to keep the ugly parts hidden behind closed doors. "I was just informed that you called the police," Davidson said, his voice tight with barely concealed irritation. "Why would you do that?" Shaq stood to his full height, towering over the man. "Because your student is being threatened," he said. Davidson's eyes flicked to Zariah, his mouth pressing into a thin line. "I'm aware of the situation. We have procedures for handling these things internally. There was no need to escalate." Shaq let out a sharp laugh. "Escalate?" He pulled the crumpled note from his pocket and held it up. "She's been getting threats for months and you didn't do a damn thing. You let this happen." Davidson's face darkened. "Mr. O'Neal, I don't appreciate your tone." Shaq took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "And I don't appreciate kids being terrorized while the people in charge look the other way." Davidson's expression flickered, just for a second. A flash of something beneath his mask. Annoyance, guilt, fear? Before he could respond, the sound of police sirens cut through the air. Davidson's posture stiffened as two uniformed officers walked through the front entrance. A young black officer with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor stepped forward. "We got a report of a student receiving violent threats." Shaq gestured to Zariah. "She's the one being targeted." The officer turned to her, softening his voice. "Miss, can you tell me what's been happening?" Zariah hesitated. Her fingers curled tighter around her sleeves. She looked from Shaq to the officer, then back at Davidson. Shaq followed her gaze. Davidson was watching her carefully. Not with concern, with expectation, like he was waiting for her to say the right thing. Or rather, the wrong thing. Shaq felt the shift before it even happened. He saw the way Zariah's body tensed, The way she suddenly shrank into herself. Fear. Not just of the threats, of what would happen if she spoke. Shaq crouched down next to her, keeping his voice calm. "Zariah, listen to me. No one can hurt you right now. You're safe." Her eyes flicked to his, uncertain. He lowered his voice. "But you gotta tell them the truth. You gotta let them help you." Zariah took a shaky breath. Then, finally, she spoke. I don't know if the police can help," she whispered. The officer frowned. "Why do you say that?" She licked her lips, her voice barely audible. "Because I think they already know." Shaq's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" the officer asked. Zariah hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's not just the students," she said. "I think some of the teachers, and maybe even the cops, they're involved too." The hallway went dead silent. Shaq felt the air shift, heavy with something dangerous. The officer stiffened. "Zariah, that's a serious accusation." She nodded. "I know." Shaq could see the fear in her, but also something else, determination. "I heard them talking," she continued. "One of the kids from the circle. His dad is a cop. A detective, I think. And last week, I was walking past the main office, and I heard Principal Davidson talking to someone on the phone. Davidson's expression turned ice cold. "That's enough." Shaq turned on him. "No, it ain't." Zariah pressed on, her voice gaining strength. "He said he'd handle the situation, that he'd make sure nothing got out. And then he said—" She swallowed hard. "He said they already took care of one problem last year." Shaq's stomach clenched. Alana. The girl who disappeared. Davidson's face was unreadable, but his posture was rigid. He wasn't panicked. He was prepared. Shaq turned back to the officer. "You hearing this?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Then, to Shaq's frustration, he hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. Doubt. Shaq's patience snapped. "She just told you a kid might have been silenced, and you're thinking about it?" He pointed at Davidson. "Are you protecting him too?" The officer straightened. "No, sir, but these are serious accusations. We need actual evidence." Shaq took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You need evidence." His voice was dangerously low. "Then get it." The officer hesitated. Then, finally, he nodded. "We'll start an official investigation," he said. "Zariah, we're going to need everything you have. Notes, messages, anything that can help us track down who's behind this." Zariah exhaled, her shoulders slumping in relief. Davidson, however, looked unfazed. Shaq didn't like that. As the officers finished taking Zariah's statement, Shaq turned back to the principal, lowering his voice. "You knew about this," he said. Davidson didn't answer. Shaq took a step closer, his voice quiet but sharp. "You knew, and you covered it up." Davidson still didn't speak, but for the first time Shaq saw something in his expression. Not fear, resignation, like he knew this was coming, like he had prepared for it. The realization sent a chill down Shaq's spine. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Shaq had learned to read between the lines a long time ago. On the court, in business, in life, there was always more to the story than what people were willing to say out loud. And right now, standing in that school hallway with Zariah shaking next to him and Principal Davidson watching everything with unsettling calm, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just bullying. This was something deeper. And Zariah knew more than she had admitted. The cops had taken her statement, promised to investigate, and then left. But Shaq could tell. Zariah was still holding something back. She hadn't said everything. Not yet. "Zariah," he said, his voice quieter now, more personal. "You trust me?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Then tell me the whole truth." She glanced around, nervous, as if she expected someone to be listening. Her voice dropped so low that Shaq had to lean in to hear. "I wasn't supposed to hear it," she whispered. "But I did." Shaq's chest tightened. Hear what? She took a shaky breath. A few weeks ago, I was walking past the teacher's lounge after school. The door was open just a little and I heard voices inside. I wasn't trying to listen, but something made me stop. Shaq didn't move, didn't breathe too hard. He just let her keep going. There were two people talking, a man and a woman. At first I couldn't tell who they were, but then the man said something about keeping the school's reputation clean. And that's when I recognized his voice. Shaq already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. Who was it? Zariah swallowed hard. Principal Davidson. Shaq's jaw clenched. Zariah continued, her voice shaky but steady. The woman, I couldn't see her, but she sounded younger. Maybe one of the teachers. She kept asking him if he was sure. She said, if this gets out, it'll ruin them. And then he said something that made my stomach turn. She paused, eyes darting to the end of the hallway, as if expecting someone to be standing there. Shaq kept his voice steady. What did he say? Zariah's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then, finally, she whispered, We took care of it last time. We'll take care of it again. Shaq felt something deep inside him twist. Last time, he repeated, his voice barely above a breath. Zariah nodded. I don't know what they were talking about at first. But then the woman said, Alana was different. She was a mistake. Alana. Shaq exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. He didn't know the girl, but he had a sinking feeling that if he looked into last year's records, he wouldn't find much. Zariah looked at him now, fear and guilt mixing in her expression. I think they did something to her. I don't know what, but it's like she never existed. They erased her. Shaq sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it settle on his chest. This wasn't just bullying. This was a system, a machine designed to silence kids like Zariah. He exhaled through his nose. Tell me about the circle. Zariah looked around again as if the walls had ears. They run everything, she whispered. They're all from rich families, CEOs, politicians, even cops. They do whatever they want because they know nothing will happen to them. If you cross them, they make you disappear. Not physically, but socially, academically, sometimes even worse. Shaq's stomach twisted. And you think they had something to do with Alana? Zariah nodded. She was like me. Smart, quiet, didn't bother anyone. Then one day she said something in class about how some kids got special treatment. She wasn't even talking about them directly. But after that, she started getting harassed. First, just little things. Then it got worse. And then, one day, she was gone. Shaq's hands curled into fists. And nobody said anything. Zariah let out a bitter laugh. Some kids did. But they got targeted too. Their grades dropped for no reason. They got blamed for things they didn't do. Some of them transferred. Some just stopped talking about it. Shaq let that sink in. This wasn't a school problem. This was a cover-up. Zariah's voice dropped lower. They left that picture in my locker for a reason. Shaq frowned. What do you mean? She looked at him now, her eyes filled with something sharp. It wasn't just a warning. It was a message. Shaq narrowed his eyes. What message? Zariah took a deep breath, then whispered, You're next. Shaq felt something cold settle in his stomach. That wasn't just a scare tactic. That was a promise. He stood up, his mind racing. We're not letting this slide, he said. Zariah looked uncertain. But what if? No, what ifs? His voice was firm, steady. They think they run this place. They think they can do whatever they want. But not anymore. Zariah bit her lip, nodding slowly. Shaq turned, scanning the hallway, his mind already making a plan. They were going to find out exactly what happened to Alana. And then they were going to bring this whole system crashing down. Shaq had seen resistance before. He had fought against doubters, skeptics, and those who wanted to keep the powerful in power. But this was different. This wasn't just about protecting a school's reputation. This was about burying the truth. And they had been doing it for years. Zariah had given him everything she knew about the circle, about Alana, about how the school board and even local authorities looked the other way. Now, he had a choice. He could let the police do their so-called investigation and hope for justice, or he could do what he did best, take matters into his own hands. And Shaquille O'Neal had never been the type to sit and wait. The next morning, Shaq found himself sitting in a conference room inside the school, across from a table full of people who wanted nothing more than to shut him up. Principal Davidson sat at the head, hands folded neatly, his expression unreadable. To his left sat a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, Linda Cartwright, the school board president. Next to her, a man in an expensive navy suit, Philip Wescott, a local businessman whose son was rumored to be part of the circle. And on Shaq's side? Nobody. Zariah's mother hadn't been informed of the meeting. The police weren't present. No parents, no students, just a room full of people who wanted to make sure this problem disappeared quietly. "Mr. O'Neal," Cartwright began, offering a tight-lipped smile, "we appreciate your concerns, but I assure you, the situation has been grossly exaggerated." Shaq didn't blink. Exaggerated. He pulled the crumpled threat note from his pocket and slid it across the table. "You call this exaggerated?" Davidson barely glanced at it. "Anonymous notes are unfortunate, but hardly evidence of a real threat." Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame making the whole table feel smaller. "So, a kid disappears last year under mysterious circumstances, another kid gets targeted for months, and you think that's just kids being kids?" Philip Wescott sighed, adjusting his cufflinks. "With all due respect, Mr. O'Neal, we appreciate your involvement, but your influence could be detrimental to the situation." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Detrimental?" He let out a low chuckle. "Y'all really don't get it, do you?" Cartwright raised a brow. "Get what?" Shaq sat back, arms crossed. "You don't get to control this anymore." Davidson shifted uncomfortably. "We're simply trying to keep things from getting blown out of proportion." Shaq nodded slowly. "Right. You want this to go away." Silence. Then Cartwright spoke, her voice measured. "We want what's best for the students, Mr. O'Neal, and making baseless accusations will only cause unnecessary panic." Shaq's patience snapped. "Baseless?" He pointed at Davidson. "She heard you say, 'We'll take care of it again.' So, tell me, what exactly did you take care of last time?" Davidson's face didn't flinch, but Shaq saw something flicker in his eyes, a moment of hesitation, of fear. "We are done here," Cartwright said, gathering her papers. Shaq didn't move. "Number? We're not." Wescott stood, adjusting his expensive watch. "If you insist on continuing this, we'll be forced to consider legal action." Shaq grinned. "Oh, please sue me." They didn't expect that. Shaq leaned forward. "You think I'm scared of you? I've dealt with real threats. You're just scared little people hiding behind your money and your fake smiles." His voice dropped lower, dead serious. "And I promise you, I'm not letting this go." No one spoke. Then Cartwright sighed. "Mr. O'Neal, I strongly advise you to walk away from this before things get complicated." Shaq smirked. "Lady, I love complicated." And then he stood up, towering over them, and walked out the door. If the school board thought they could control this, they had severely underestimated him. By noon, Shaq had already made the first call, to one of the biggest sports reporters in the country. By 3 p.m., the story was everywhere. Shaq calls out Lincoln High School over racism, bullying cover-up. Student targeted for months. School ignored her pleas for help. How deep does this go? Shaq demands investigation into school corruption. Twitter exploded. Instagram was flooded with reposts. Celebrities, activists, and journalists all started demanding answers. Parents showed up at the school, furious. Alumni spoke out, sharing their stories of being silenced. And the school? They panicked. By the next morning, the phone calls started. First, a friendly request. Shaq was sitting in his car outside the school when an unknown number called. "This is Shaquille," a smooth voice replied. "Mr. O'Neal, this is Daniel Mercer. I represent some of the families involved in this situation. We believe this is all a misunderstanding, and we'd love to have a private conversation." Shaq smirked. "That's so?" Mercer's tone stayed polite but firm. "There's no need for things to get uglier than they already are. Perhaps we can find a way to resolve this quietly." Shaq chuckled. "Let me guess, you want me to back off." A pause. Then Mercer said, "It would be in everyone's best interest." Shaq's smile disappeared. "Not happening." Mercer sighed. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable. But if you insist on making enemies, I'd be careful. Powerful people don't like being embarrassed." Shaq's grip tightened on the wheel. "You threatening me?" "Of course not," Mercer said smoothly. "Just giving some friendly advice." Shaq didn't hesitate. "Here's my friendly advice. Go to hell." And then he hung up. Within hours, the real fight began. Local news stations started questioning the allegations. Anonymous sources claimed the incident was exaggerated. Fake accounts flooded social media, calling Zariah a liar, claiming Shaq was using this for attention. But Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled down. He went live on Instagram, looking directly into the camera. "I don't care how much money y'all got. I don't care what kind of power you think you have. You are not getting away with this." And then, for the first time, he named them. Principal Davidson, School Board President Linda Cartwright, Philip Wescott, the families protecting the circle. "We see you, and you're going to answer for what you've done." The internet exploded. Cartwright and Wescott immediately released statements denying everything. The school tried to paint Shaq as a misinformed outsider. But the damage was done, because now the entire country was watching. That night, Shaq got another call. Blocked number. He answered. A deep voice spoke, calm and slow. "You need to stop." Shaq didn't reply. The voice continued. "This isn't your fight. You don't understand what you're messing with." Shaq finally spoke, his tone ice cold. "No, I do understand. That's why I ain't stopping." Silence. Then a final warning. "You keep this up, and people are going to get hurt." Shaq's grip tightened. "Yeah," he said. "They already have." And then, before they could say another word, he hung up. This wasn't just about Zariah anymore. This was about all the kids they had silenced. And Shaq. He was about to make damn sure their voices were finally heard. Shaq had been in high-pressure situations before. Finals, playoffs, million-dollar business deals. But this was different. This wasn't about competition or money. This was about a kid's life, and time was running out. The morning after the threats against Shaq started, he called Zariah to check in. She didn't answer. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. A bad feeling settled in his gut. He immediately called the only other number he had, Zariah's mother. She picked up on the first ring, her voice panicked. "She's gone." Shaq's body went still. "What do you mean, gone?" "She didn't come home last night," her mother said, her voice shaking. "She called me around 10, said she was staying at a friend's. But when I checked, none of her friends knew where she was." Shaq's mind raced. "Did you call the police?" A pause. Then, in a defeated whisper, she said, "They won't help." Shaq clenched his jaw. Of course they wouldn't, because if Zariah was right, if cops were involved in the cover-up, then calling them wouldn't bring her home. It might make things worse. "I'll find her," Shaq said, his voice low. "I promise." And he meant it. Shaq was already dialing numbers when his phone buzzed with an unknown caller. Normally, he ignored those. But something told him to pick up. "This is Shaq." A hesitant voice came through. "Mr. O'Neal, my name is Vanessa Ruiz. I'm a journalist." Shaq's brow furrowed. "Okay." "I've been investigating Lincoln High School for over a year," she continued. "I saw your press conference. You're right, this goes way beyond Zariah. But no one would publish my story. They buried it." Shaq leaned forward. "Who buried it?" "The school board, the police, maybe even people higher than that," Vanessa said. "I had witnesses, parents, but one by one they either stopped talking or disappeared." Shaq felt his chest tighten. "Like Alana?" A pause. "Yes," Vanessa said, "and I think I can prove it." An hour later, Shaq met Vanessa in a small diner on the outskirts of town. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and tired eyes that had seen too much. She wasn't alone. Next to her sat a man in his 40s, his shirt wrinkled, his tie loosened like he had just walked out of a battle. "This is Caleb Moore," Vanessa said. "He teaches history at Lincoln High." Shaq raised a brow. "A teacher?" Caleb gave a humorless laugh. "For now." Shaq studied him. "You got something to say?" Caleb glanced at Vanessa, then took a deep breath. "I have proof." Shaq's stomach flipped. "Of what?" Caleb pulled out a flash drive and slid it across the table. "The circle. The cover-ups. The way the administration protects certain students while pushing others out." Shaq picked up the flash drive. "How'd you get this?" "I've been keeping records for years," Caleb said. "I tried going to the police. They ignored me. Then I tried the school board. They threatened to fire me." Shaq exhaled slowly. "What's on here?" "Emails, records, surveillance footage." Shaq's eyes sharpened. "Surveillance?" Caleb nodded. "There are cameras all over Lincoln High, but the footage is controlled by the administration. I found archived files, things that were supposed to be deleted." Shaq's grip on the drive tightened. "And what do they show?" Caleb hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "They show what happened to Alana." They found a quiet place to watch the files. Vanessa's office, a small space cluttered with stacks of documents and unopened mail. Caleb plugged in the flash drive. A folder popped up, filled with video files, each labeled by date. Shaq leaned in as Caleb clicked on a file from last year. The footage was grainy, black and white, but it was clear enough. The timestamp showed it was late at night, long after school hours. And there was Alana. She was walking down the hallway, looking over her shoulder like she knew she was being followed. Then, suddenly, a figure stepped out in front of her. Shaq felt his breath hitch. A tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in dark clothing. Alana froze. There was no sound, but her body language was clear. She was terrified. Then another figure appeared. And another. Not adults. Students. The circle. The video cut off. Shaq turned to Caleb, his voice sharp. "Where's the rest?" Caleb looked pained. "That's all I found. The rest is missing." Shaq's mind raced. But now they had a proof that Alana didn't just transfer. She was taken. And Zariah could be next. Shaq wasted no time. He called in every favor he had. Friends, security contacts, anyone who could help find her. It was Vanessa who got the first lead. She had sent out messages to former students who had faced bullying at Lincoln High. One of them, a girl named Deja, responded. "She's safe," Deja texted, "but she's scared." Shaq's hands tightened around his phone. Safe was good, but scared meant she wasn't out of danger. He texted back. "Where is she?" The response came fast. "Abandoned house, west side. I'll send the address." Shaq was already moving. The house was a rundown place on the outskirts of town, windows boarded up, the lawn overgrown. It looked empty. Shaq pushed open the rusted gate and stepped inside. "Zariah?" His voice was careful, controlled. "It's me." Silence. Then, a shuffle. Shaq turned toward the sound, and there, half hidden behind a broken-down couch, was Zariah. She looked exhausted, her hoodie pulled tight over her head, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear. Shaq crouched down. "Hey, kid." Her lip trembled. I didn't know where else to go." Shaq nodded slowly. "You're safe now." Her eyes filled with tears. "No, I'm not." Shaq's chest tightened. "Why do you say that?" Zariah swallowed hard. "Because they know I heard them," she whispered, "and they're not going to let me leave this time." Shaq felt his pulse hammer in his ears. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about the fight ahead, and he was ready for it. The school tried to keep it quiet. They tried to ignore the headlines, dismiss the outrage, and bury the truth under rehearsed statements and shallow apologies. But the world wasn't looking away this time. Shaq had made sure of that. For the first time in the school's history, Lincoln High's board was being forced into the spotlight. A press conference had been scheduled, a last-ditch attempt to control the damage. But Shaq wasn't coming to listen. He was coming to finish this. The gymnasium had been transformed into a stage for damage control. Rows of chairs lined the polished floor, cameras stood ready, and reporters whispered among themselves, waiting for the show to begin. At the front of the room sat the power players: Principal Davidson, Linda Cartwright, Philip Wescott, the same people who had ignored, silenced, and protected the guilty. They sat with carefully neutral expressions, dressed in their finest, their hands folded like they were about to give a Sunday sermon. Shaq stood at the back of the room with Zariah, Vanessa Ruiz, and Caleb Moore. Zariah's hoodie was pulled over her head, her hands trembling at her sides. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You good?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. She wasn't, not really, but she was ready. At exactly noon, Cartwright stepped up to the podium, clearing her throat before speaking into the microphone. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "We appreciate you all being here today to address the unfortunate concerns that have recently surfaced regarding Lincoln High School." Shaq's jaw clenched. Unfortunate concerns. That was how they were framing this. Davidson sat stiffly behind her, his face a carefully controlled mask. Wescott, however, looked irritated, like this was a waste of his time. Cartwright continued. "First and foremost, we want to assure the community that we take every student's safety seriously. While certain allegations have been made, we have found no evidence of any organized wrongdoing within our school. Any incidents of misconduct are isolated and do not reflect the values we uphold." A few reporters murmured, some taking notes, others exchanging skeptical glances. Shaq gave Vanessa a look. She nodded. It was time. Shaq moved forward just as Cartwright was. "You're about to continue." "Hold up." The room shifted. All eyes turned toward him. Davidson stiffened, Wescott exhaled sharply, and Cartwright forced a thin smile. "Mr. O'Neal, while we respect your concern, this is a structured—" Shaq ignored her. Instead, he turned to the audience, the cameras, the reporters. "You're lying," he said flatly. Cartwright blinked. "Excuse me?" Shaq pulled his phone from his pocket, raising it so everyone could see. "You said there's no evidence." He turned to Caleb. "Run it." Caleb, standing off to the side with a laptop, tapped a key. The projector flickered to life. And then, the surveillance footage played. The grainy, black-and-white video filled the screen behind them. Alana. Walking down the hallway, glancing over her shoulder. The moment, the circle surrounded her. The second, the video cut off. A murmur swept through the crowd. Shaq turned back to the podium. "You want to explain that?" Cartwright's face paled. Wescott's hands tightened into fists. Davidson looked frozen, like a man who just realized he was standing on a collapsing bridge. Shaq didn't stop there. He gestured to Vanessa. She stepped forward, holding up a stack of printed emails. "These are internal school records," she announced. "They show that multiple students, including Alana and Zariah, reported harassment. They were ignored, and, in some cases, actively silenced." The whispers grew louder. One of the reporters stood. "Miss Ruiz, where did you obtain these records?" Caleb spoke next. "From the school's own system." Davidson finally snapped out of his silence. "This is outrageous," he barked. "That footage proves nothing. It doesn't show what happened next. You can't just throw out baseless accusations." Zariah stepped forward, and the room went silent. She pulled back her hoodie, revealing her tear-streaked face, her voice shaking but clear. "They were going to do the same thing to me." Cartwright opened her mouth, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. But powerful people don't go down without a fight, and that's when they change tactics. Wescott suddenly leaned forward, his voice cool and calculated. "Mr. O'Neal, you've taken an awfully strong stance in this. But let's talk about your real motivation." Shaq's brows furrowed. "The hell are you talking about?" Wescott tilted his head. "You've used your fame to stir public outrage, but is this truly about justice, or are you using this as a publicity stunt?" The shift was subtle, but effective. Some of the reporters hesitated, their pens pausing. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You really think that's gonna work?" Wescott smirked. "I think people should question why a celebrity is suddenly inserting himself into a local school matter." Shaq let out a humorless laugh. "You really think you can make me the villain?" Wescott shrugged. "It's a fair question, isn't it? Or maybe you just enjoy playing hero." The words were meant to shake him, to plant doubt. Shaq turned to the cameras. "You know what? Maybe he's right." The room went still. Shaq stepped forward, eyes locked on Wescott. "Maybe I do like playing hero. Maybe I do like standing up for kids who can't fight for themselves. You know why?" He pointed at Zariah. "Because nobody else did." Wescott opened his mouth, but Shaq cut him off. "You want the truth. The truth is, you let this happen. You let kids like Alana and Zariah suffer because it was easier to pretend it wasn't real." His voice was steel now. "But it was real. And now, the world knows it." A pause. Then, applause. It started slow, but it grew. Reporters, parents, even some faculty members in the back of the room, because no one was buying Wescott's spin. Not this time. The pressure hit fast. The video spread like wildfire. Parents demanded resignations. The local news ripped into the administration. Lawsuits were filed. And by the next morning, Davidson resigned. Cartwright followed. And Wescott. Turns out people started digging into his family, into how many times his son had been protected, into how many kids had been pushed out of Lincoln High. Shaq didn't even have to say anything. The system was eating itself alive. A week later, Shaq sat with Zariah and her mom in their small living room. Zariah looked different. Still tired, still healing, but lighter. She gave him a small smile. "So, what happens now?" Shaq smiled back. "Now? They don't get to hurt anyone else." She nodded. Then, after a long pause, "Thank you." Shaq patted her shoulder. "Anytime, kid." Because this wasn't about being a hero. This was about doing what was right. And he'd do it again. Every single time. Shaq had learned a long time ago that justice didn't come easy. It wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making sure it stayed exposed. And that was the real battle. Because even when corruption was dragged into the light, there were always people trying to shove it back into the shadows. But this time, they wouldn't get the chance. The fallout came fast. By the end of the week, Lincoln High was in crisis mode. The footage of Alana, the leaked emails, the school's long history of ignoring abuse. It was too much to sweep under the rug. The parents were furious. The community was demanding accountability. And then the hammer finally dropped. The circle was officially disbanded. The students responsible, Wescott's son, the principal's nephew, and 3 others, were expelled. Their parents fought it, of course. Lawyers were called, threats were made, but no amount of money could undo what had already been exposed. Not this time. And when the police finally opened a criminal investigation into Alana's disappearance, the entire house of cards started falling apart. Shaq wasn't surprised when Davidson and Cartwright both lawyered up. Their names were everywhere now, tied to negligence, cover-ups, and intimidation tactics. The school board scrambled to save itself, but the public was watching too closely. So they did what all institutions do when they're cornered. They sacrificed their own. By the next week, Davidson and Cartwright were officially removed. But for Shaq, that still wasn't enough. Shaq wasn't the type to celebrate small wins. Expelling a few rich kids wasn't justice, it was just the beginning. So he made calls. Big ones. He sat down with state officials, education leaders, and civil rights organizations. He made sure the conversation wasn't just about Lincoln High, because this wasn't just one school's problem. This was a systemic problem, and Shaq wasn't about to let it keep happening. Within a month, new policies were announced. Anonymous reporting systems were put in place for students facing bullying or threats. An independent investigation team was assigned to review past student complaints. Mandatory anti-discrimination training became a requirement for all faculty and staff. It wasn't perfect, it wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And that was enough. Shaq met with Zariah again a few weeks later. This time, it wasn't in a school hallway, a news conference, or a secret hideout. It was at a small cafe near her house. She looked different. Not in the way she dressed or spoke, but in the way she held herself. Straight, stronger, like someone who had learned just how powerful she really was. "How's school?" Shaq asked, stirring his coffee. Zariah smirked. "Kinda quiet now that half the administration got fired." Shaq chuckled. "That so?" She nodded. "The new principal's all right. Some teachers left, but I don't think anyone's complaining. The kids who were part of the circle, most of them transferred." She took a sip of her drink, her expression turning thoughtful. "It's weird. For so long, I thought, this was just how things worked, that people like me didn't really have a voice. But now," she met Shaq's eyes, "now I know we do." Shaq smiled. "Damn right you do." She exhaled, playing with the edge of her napkin. "It's not perfect. Some kids still whisper. Some teachers still act like none of this happened. But I don't feel invisible anymore." She looked up at him. "That's because of you." Shaq shook his head. "Nah, it's because of you." Zariah hesitated, then gave a small smile. "Guess we both did something right." Shaq grinned. "Guess we did." A week later, Shaq stood outside Lincoln High, hands in his pockets, looking up at the building one last time. It still looked the same. The bricks, the windows, the banners. But it felt different, because now people knew the truth. He knew this wasn't the end. There would always be another school, another kid like Zariah, another system trying to bury the truth. But that didn't scare him, because now people were paying attention. And that meant change was possible. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A message from Zariah. "Thank you for believing me." Shaq smiled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He didn't need a thank you. He just needed to know that the next time this happened, people wouldn't look away. And for the first time in a long time, he believed they wouldn't. Silence lets injustice grow. Awareness stops it cold. If this story shook you, imagine the ones that never get told. Every Zariah deserves to be heard. Every Alana deserves justice. Speak up. Pay attention. Hold them accountable. Because the next voice that needs saving might be closer than you think.